In July of 1947, the United States Army issued a press release saying it had recovered a flying disc. It was printed in newspapers across the country within hours. The next day, the Army took it back and said the wreckage was only a weather balloon. For 30 years, almost no one spoke of it again. Then the men who had been there began to talk. They said the material was nothing like a balloon, and that what they handled could not be cut or burned. What crashed on a New Mexico ranch in the summer of 1947 has never stopped being argued about. This is the deep dive of Roswell, the crash the Army announced and then unannounced. To understand Roswell, you have to understand the summer it happened in. The Second World War had ended less than 2 years earlier. The Cold War had not yet been named, but it had already begun. The Soviet Union did not yet have the atomic bomb, and the United States was desperate to know when it would. In that climate of secrecy and fear, the skies over America filled with strange reports. On June 24, 1947, a pilot named Kenneth Arnold was flying near Mount Rainier in Washington state. He reported 9 shining objects moving in formation at impossible speed. He said they moved like a saucer would if you skipped it across water. A newspaper editor turned that phrase into 2 words, flying saucer, and the phrase spread across the world. In the weeks that followed, hundreds of Americans reported saucers in the sky. It was the first great UFO wave, and it was at its peak in early July. That was the backdrop when a rancher in New Mexico found something scattered across his land. His name was William Brazel, though everyone called him Mac. He was the foreman of the Foster Ranch, a remote stretch of grazing land near the town of Corona. Corona sat about 75 miles northwest of the city of Roswell. Sometime in the first week of July, a violent thunderstorm rolled across the high desert. The next morning, Brazel rode out to check his sheep and found the ground covered in debris. He described a field of wreckage scattered across hundreds of yards. There was thin metallic foil light as paper that he said would not stay crumpled. There were small beams or sticks, like balsa wood, light and hard to break. There was a tough paper backing, and a kind of tape printed with strange figures along the edges. Brazel had seen weather balloons come down on the ranch before, and he said this was not that. He showed some of the pieces to his neighbors, the Proctors. Loretta Proctor would later say she held a sliver of the beam and could not burn it or cut it. Brazel kept some of the debris and, a few days later, drove into Roswell. On July 7th, he reported what he had found to the county sheriff, George Wilcox. Wilcox thought it was strange enough to call the local Army base. That base was the Roswell Army Airfield, and it was not an ordinary base. It was home to the 509th Bomb Group. The 509th was the only military unit in the world that had ever dropped an atomic bomb. The planes that bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki had flown from this command. In 1947, the most sensitive nuclear unit on Earth sat just outside Roswell. So when the sheriff called about strange wreckage, the base took it seriously. The base sent its intelligence officer, Major Jesse Marcel. Marcel drove out to the ranch with a counterintelligence agent named Sheridan Cavett. They followed Brazel to the debris field and walked it. Marcel later said he had never seen anything like the material in his life. He filled his car with pieces of it, and so did Cavett. On the way back, Marcel stopped at his own house in the middle of the night. He woke his wife and his 11-year-old son to show them the strange wreckage on the kitchen floor. His son, Jesse Marcel Jr., would describe that foil and those beams for the rest of his life. He remembered small symbols along one of the beams, like little embossed figures. The debris was taken back to the base, and then on July 8th, the base did something extraordinary. The base public information officer, Lieutenant Walter Haut, wrote and released a press statement. It said the field had come into possession of a flying disc. It said the disc had been recovered from a ranch in the Roswell region. The base commander, Colonel William Blanchard, approved it. The statement went out over the news wires in the early afternoon. The Roswell Daily Record ran the headline the next day. It read, "RAAF captures flying disc on ranch in Roswell region." Within hours, the story moved across the country and around the world. For a few hours, the United States Army was officially on record as having recovered a flying disc. And then, just as quickly, the story was pulled back. That same afternoon, the debris was flown north to Fort Worth Army Airfield in Texas. Fort Worth was the headquarters of the 8th Air Force. It was commanded by Brigadier General Roger Ramey. Ramey called the press into his office. On the floor of his office, he laid out torn foil, broken sticks, and the shredded remains of something. He announced that the wreckage was not a flying disc at all. He said it was a weather balloon and its radar reflector. Nothing more. A photographer captured Major Marcel kneeling on the floor beside the debris. Those photographs ran in papers across the country the next morning. The flying disc had become a weather balloon in a single news cycle. The Roswell Daily Record printed the correction. The general had spoken, the explanation was mundane, and the public lost interest within days. For believers, That office in Fort Worth is where the cover-up happened. They argue that the real debris was swapped for the torn remains of an ordinary balloon before the cameras came in. For skeptics, it is simply where an embarrassing mistake was quietly corrected. Either way, the official Roswell story ended in July of 1947, and for the next 30 years it stayed ended. The town of Roswell moved on, and the country forgot. The men who had handled the debris went back to their lives and said nothing. The case might have stayed buried forever, except for one man and one phone call. In the late 1970s, a nuclear physicist named Stanton Friedman was lecturing on UFOs. A radio station manager told him about a retired officer who claimed to have handled wreckage from a crashed saucer. That officer was Jesse Marcel. In 1978, Friedman tracked Marcel down in Louisiana. Marcel, now an old man, told his story for the first time in public. He said the material he recovered was not from any balloon he had ever seen. He described the same foil that would not stay creased, and the beams that would not burn or break. He believed what he had been ordered to display in Fort Worth was not what he had brought back from the ranch. He believed the real debris had been substituted. Marcel's account reopened a case that had been closed for 3 decades, and once the door was open, other people came forward. In 1980, 2 researchers published a book called The Roswell Incident. It gathered the witness accounts and put Roswell back into the public mind. Over the following years, more witnesses and more dramatic claims emerged. Some said the wreckage was only the beginning. Frankie Rowe was a child in 1947. She said her father, a Roswell firefighter, told the family he had seen a downed craft and small bodies. Glenn Dennis was a young mortician in Roswell. He said the base had called him asking about small, child-sized caskets. He said a nurse he knew described seeing strange bodies, and then was transferred away and never seen again. Other accounts described debris being trucked off, fields being swept, and witnesses being warned to stay silent. By the 1990s, the story had grown far beyond a field of foil. It now included a crashed craft, recovered bodies, and a vast government cover-up. A set of documents surfaced, supposedly secret, describing a group called Majestic 12. The documents claimed a panel of scientists and officials had managed the recovery of crashed alien craft. Most researchers, even many UFO researchers, came to regard the Majestic 12 papers as fakes. Then, in 1995, a film appeared that claimed to show an alien autopsy from Roswell. It was broadcast around the world. It was later admitted to be a staged reconstruction. But the mythology kept growing, and Roswell became the most famous UFO case on Earth. The growing claims eventually drew the attention of the United States Congress. In the early 1990s, a New Mexico congressman named Stephen Schiff began asking the government for records. He felt he was being stonewalled, and he asked the General Accounting Office to investigate. That pressure pushed the Air Force to finally explain what had happened in 1947. In 1994, the Air Force released a report. It said the debris had not come from a weather balloon after all. It said the original balloon story had itself been a cover, but not a cover for aliens. The real source, the report said, was a secret program called Project Mogul. Project Mogul was a Cold War effort to detect Soviet nuclear tests from a great distance. The idea was to float arrays of microphones high into the upper atmosphere on long trains of balloons. Those microphones would listen for the distant sound of an atomic blast. The program was classified, and the men on the ground were not told what they were launching. A Mogul flight, launched from Alamogordo in June of 1947, had gone missing. The report argued that this lost balloon train was what came down on the Foster Ranch, and the materials matched the descriptions in a striking way. The balloon trains used neoprene rubber foil reflectors and balsa wood beams. Some of the reflectors were taped with a reinforcing tape that, by chance, was printed with pinkish flower-like symbols. A child looking at that tape might well have called it strange figures or hieroglyphs. The material that would not burn and snapped back into shape sounds to skeptics like early foil laminate and neoprene. For many investigators, Project Mogul explained the debris better than anything else, but it did not explain the bodies. So in 1997, the Air Force released a second report. It was titled, in effect, Case Closed. It addressed the witness accounts of small bodies recovered from the desert. Its explanation was that people were remembering and merging real events from the 1950s. In those years, the Air Force had dropped anthropomorphic crash test dummies from high-altitude balloons over New Mexico. The dummies were used to test parachutes and the limits of the human body. They had bald heads, simplified features, and were carried in trucks and recovered from the desert. The report suggested that witnesses, decades later, had blended these dummy recoveries with the 1947 crash. Critics pointed out the obvious problem. The dummy drops happened in the 1950s, years after 1947. The Air Force answer was that human memory does not keep clean dates across half a century, and that is the heart of the whole Roswell problem. Almost every dramatic witness was interviewed decades after the event. Memory is not a recording, and across 30 or 50 years, stories shift, merge, and grow. A man who once held strange foil becomes, in retelling, a man who saw a craft. A rumor about caskets becomes a first-hand account of bodies. None of this proves the witnesses lied. It means their memories, however sincere, are difficult to test. And so Roswell settles into two camps that have never agreed. To the believers, the Retraction is the smoking gun, and Mogul is just a better cover story. To the skeptics, Mogul explains the debris, faulty memory explains the bodies, and the case is closed. What both sides agree on is small but real. Something did fall on that ranch in the summer of 1947. The Army really did announce on the record that it had captured a flying disc, and it really did take that announcement back the very next day. Those are the facts that have kept the story alive for almost 80 years. The town of Roswell long ago made peace with its strange fame. It built a UFO museum, and every summer it holds a festival that draws crowds from around the world. The word Roswell itself has become shorthand for the idea of a government hiding the truth about the skies. Whatever crashed on the Foster Ranch, the story it created never came down. A weather balloon would have been forgotten in a week. A flying disc, announced and then denied, became the most famous mystery of the modern age. So the question that hung over that desert in 1947 still hangs over it now. Was it a secret listening balloon, remembered wrong by old men? Or was it something the Army saw clearly, held briefly, and decided the world was not ready to know? What do you think really came down on that ranch in the summer of 1947? Tell us in the comments. Remember to like and subscribe, and always stay curious.